Today, we're talking about both the DISA STIG and the PCI DSS. So I'm going to go through and switch my screen to share a couple slides, just be able to do a high 10,000 foot level overview of the differences between these frameworks.
We didn't warn Eric.
There's slides. It was working. There's only a couple, I promise, right? I know, right? So the idea behind this is that I just want a little bit of information shared with you. So the DISA STIG is meant to go through, it's a guideline for securing technologies and systems used by the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. This is specifically saying, hey, these are the same standard rules that we're doing across everybody. So we have a ability to say, if this project is working the same as this project, we need to make sure it's locked down. And here's the standard guidelines. On the scope, it's primarily focused for government and for the contractors that are working with the government and military systems. Compliance is making sure that you've got the security posture of systems to ensure the federal security requirements. So your password has to be so complicated, XYZ. And then the implementation is done by this STIG. So it helps provide the detailed configuration settings of saying, hey, if you've got a RHEL 8 box, here's how you're securing that versus a RHEL 9 box. Some technology changes underneath that. How you harden a RHEL 7 box versus a RHEL 6 box has changed over time. So we're trying to go through and make that better. That's on the DISA STIG side. On the PCI DSS side of the house, it's set standards for folks that are working with credit card information during or after a financial transaction. So that means anybody going through buying, selling, purchasing, being a middleman, any of these are going to fall underneath the PCI DSS side of the house. So it's all organizations that accept, process, store, or transmit credit card information, which is important. So there's a lot of businesses that PCI DSS is going to also apply to as a framework. Compliance is required for organizations that handle payment card data. There are some things that are out of scope. Depending on your compliance team, they're going to be able to let you know, hey, is this something that we have to work with or something that we can ignore because we've offset that to somebody else? And then the PCI DSS outlines specific security requirements, including encryption, access control, and regular security testings. And to pull back last week's just slightly, for the CIS, it provides a set of best practices for everybody. This is not just military, this is not just contractors or people working with credit cards. The scope is going to be a broad range of different organizations, including private sector, government, nonprofit entities. It's just a good set of rules to get up and running. So many of these organizations adopt this as part of their security policies just to get something to start with. And then it also helps provide detailed benchmarks in securing systems. But the last slide, I promise, we're not going to get heavy on any more slides. The 3 comparisons on the target audiences for 3 frameworks. DISA STIG is primarily for U.S. government and military systems. PCI is for organizations handling credit cards. CIS is just a good rule or good practices that many people can go through and use. On the compliance requirements, both STIG and PCI have mandatory compliance requirements. The CIS is generally volunteered, and it's pretty well adopted places. Focus areas for STIGs are in specific technologies and configurations. If you're running X piece of software, there's probably a STIG for that. When Nate and I were looking at stuff before the stream, there are STIGs for Android. There are STIGs for Solaris.
I showed while you were switching how there's like a million of them.
Specific areas, specific versions, and deep dive there. PCI is going to focus on those payment on the credit cards and such. CIS provides that broader set of best practices for all of cybersecurity. That's all the slides I've got, just as a side-by-side comparison. We can jump back to our notes.
Slides.
No more slides.
We bring him in as a guest. The slides.
Just drop it there.
We tried to think of a better way to show this, but the slides worked. So sorry about that, folks.
There used to be a couple different resources that did comparisons between PCI and DISA STIG and CIS. Those resources are no longer available for free online. So wanted to be able to give at least another example of a 10,000 foot overview.
Right. So we were going to talk about a workstation versus a server. Did you have that prepped, or did that not work out?
What we did earlier was specifically looking at the STIG for the server side. When you're looking at the STIG, you have the option for server or server with GUI. If you're talking about a workstation, there are different settings that you can go through and make sure that GNOME gets a little bit more locked down. To answer your question, the VM is up, but it doesn't show as much as I was hoping. So
okay.
That's what I wanted to go through and talk about, where the practical application when going from a GUI or from the server side hardening to a GUI, you typically have login information. If you're installing RHEL by default and you install a whole bunch of users, typically it's going to have like that user in a list that you click and then type in your password. The workstation with GUI or server with GUI, when you harden it, it has no username and no password. You will have to go through and install and tweak a couple of other things to get the classified or unclassified banner and the DoD login page.
Right.
So
you and I were talking in preparation for this. These controls go further than just what you can do at the operating system level. You said there's like banners and labels that have to be put onto the machines that are classified versus unclassified. And, of course, there's clearances that go into whether you can use those machines and not, things like that.
Right. Correct. So depending on typically you'll have security banners that will go software wise that you can install. This is helping to get you closer to being STIG compliant, but you're still going to get hands on the box to make sure that you're going to be having to find out what your risk model is, your organization.
Right. Cool. I hope that covers what the STIG is and the differences between that and CIS and PCI DSS. We've talked about PCI DSS a bunch. You did talk a little bit about what that is in your slides there. Do we have any deeper? We want to go on that before we do have another demo, which will work around PCI DSS. But is there any more conversation we need to have there? So
to wrap up the DISA STIG there's also the ability for you to go do this all offline or air-gapped networks. And it supports going through and doing the STIGs and the hardening on that. You can do this with OpenSCAP on your local box if you have no internet connection. Versus if we're usually switching over to PCI, that needs to have communication to the cloud or to some processing plant to where you're able to go through and say, hey, is this bank got money in it? Yes, no. Is it approved?
Right. You can't have an air-gapped payment terminal. It just doesn't work.
Right.
It needs to be able to talk to the payment gateway.
Absolutely.